in political science and directs the CPEL from the University of Montpellier. He researched and published behavior, often on all three at the same time. Recently, he published Le Projet Culturel des Territoires, Cultural Policies in Europe, a Participatory Turn, and Festival, Territoire et Société. Emmanuel Negret will speak with us about the topic of peripheries. Will tell us about the different perspectives of being peripheral, about the coherence of the notion of periphery and the contradictions that entails. It is a fantasy of any periphery to become the new center, and what kind of dangers this brings. So, Manuel?
Yes. So I had a title, Being the Center, with a question mark. And I will question the question mark in my conference. First, and I add the title, which is Bread and Roses. And I will begin by Bread and Roses. As you probably know, Bread and Roses was the hymn of workers, women workers in the textile in Massachusetts. And in the lyrics, I will not sing, I'm sorry, but in the lyrics there are hearts starve as well as bodies. Give us bread, but give us roses. And this idea of a struggle for both material and symbolic reasons was taken up during the mobilization of the English gay and lesbian movement alongside the Welsh miners during the 80s in England. I think it is directly related to the way we need to think about the periphery in cultural, not just geographical terms. In my presentation, I will offer a reflection on the use of the notion of periphery in the cultural domain. At the outset, I would like to say that it is a use which is paradoxical. The paradox is that the evolution of the notion makes the reference to the periphery very complex. However, despite this complexity, peripherality remains a central issue in our democracies. It is all the more central when we approach in the cultural domain. So I will divide my keynote in three parts. First, recalling the origins and the evolutions of the notion of periphery. Second, giving three examples of what is the peripheral question in the cultural domain. And third, I will ask the Leninist question, what is to be done? And I hope have enough time to develop all that. First of all, recalling the origin of the notion of periphery, I have to evoke one Egyptian researcher, Samir Amin, who first, through his work, Unequal Exchange, explained to the classical Marxism that there were not only a relationship and a struggle between producers and workers, but this relation is quite different according to the place. And this first complexification of the notion of domination with the notion of periphery was quite interesting compared to the classical domination of capital over labor. In particular, he indicates that in central spaces of capital accumulation, the proletariat has a certain capacity of autonomy and social elevation to constitute a huge middle class. In the contrary, in the spaces far from the center, the exploitation of labor takes much harsher forms, which deprive proletariat of autonomy and capacity of elevation. Samir Amin pleads for an awareness by the peripheral countries of their condition of exploitation and for the claim to be a new center of world economic exchange. This idea of, and there is no question mark, periphery has to become a new center. I will question that. The vision of periphery has subsequently been used in various ways. I will just recall some aspect of this, but insist on the way through which it is not only the content of the periphery that's changed, as Alvaro said. It is also the kind of relationship between center and periphery. In Samir Amin's literature, the relationship is a relation of domination. Subsequently, in political science, for instance, there is a huge tradition of center-periphery analysis, which explains that the center, the political center, in order to be the center, needs to establish compromises with periphery and eventually negotiate the rules in order to make society, to integrate everybody. So in this sense, the relationship between center and periphery is no more a kind of direct domination, but a kind of negotiation. It is a strategic interaction. And it is quite different from the first dimension. In electoral analysis, the notion of periphery is now used by geographers, political scientists, to explain certain electoral behaviors, in particular in the emergence of the extreme rights. For them, the motivation of the far-right voter is negative and precisely linked to his or her peripheral situation, which is experienced as a lack of resource, an ostracism, which expressed by the radicality of the vote. In France, in Europe, but also in United States, with this notion of Rust Belt, explaining a kind of vote in favor of Donald Trump, for instance. This is an object of controversy, naturally, because as Boyan said yesterday in his remark, it is not evident that because you are geographically far from the center, you are socially dominated. And it is not because you live in the center that you are not peripheral. On the contrary, the huge majority of dominated people, of peripheral people from a social point of view, live in the metropolis. By extending the notion of periphery to that of margin, we are witnessing now a multiplication of peripheral or marginal situation. Social class, gender, age, ethnicity, sexual orientation are today dimensions that divide society or by which one tries to divide them. This multiplication is a complexification. As you know, there is a difference between what is complicated and what is complex. What is complicated is that you want to do something, you know how to do, but it will be hard to do. The complex is you even don't know how to do. And it is the situation with the complexification of peripherality. The complexity is due to the lack of alignment between the peripheries, between the peripheralities. The perspective of realignment of situation of periphery from a sexual, age, race, geography, political point of view. This is intersectionality, the convergence of the margin to impose a new center, faces great difficulties because of the contradiction between the respective interests, as showed by this story of mobilization of gay and lesbian alongside the miners in Wales. And there was tensions to be okay with the same. Is it the same struggle? So there are contradictions between respective interests. And another difficulty is the divergence between strategies regarding the center in our current society. If peripheries have multiplied, center also are several now. So if there are peripheries, there are distinct principles of centrality, and that is principle of domination. And if we say that, and Alvaro told us that there was a perpetual change of peripheralities, and I agree with that, there is a difference in coherence between center and periphery, or centers and peripheries. There is much more divisions inside the peripheries and between peripheries than between the centers or principles of centrality. And this become evident too in the cultural field. This will be my second point. To understand the importance of the peripheral issue in culture, I will take 3 examples, each of which illustrates the problem we face. The first example is retrospective, about cultural policies in Southern Europe. The second example deals with the sociology of cultural practices. And the third example concerns current research on festivals. First of all, cultural policies in Southern Europe. I just recall a project shared with my friend Louise Bonnet, here present, about an attempt to define what was the singularity of Southern Europe cultural policies. And the project first began by starting by criticizing the theories based on the alleged origin of a Southern European essence in culture. And we visited several theories, putting the point on the anthropology, for instance. The identity of Southern Europe would be due to the familial structures. Some Americans gave many work and hypotheses on that, very controversy. The second hypothesis was historical. What was common in these different countries was the presence of a recent authoritarian past, and it affected a kind of cultural policy way of building. And the third, for instance, was political, as for social reasons and for economical reasons, the level of clientelism in Southern Europe was higher than elsewhere. And it explained, or it tried to explain, a singularity of the way through which cultural policy was implemented and defined in Southern Europe. But none of these reasons were satisfactory for us. None. Why? Because they didn't explain the huge diversity inside the Southern Europe between secondary territories, first of all. And second, these hypotheses, anthropologic, historic, politic, were not satisfactory because they were not only present in the Southern Europe. Germany has a recent authoritarian past, and evidence of political clientelism in cultural policy elsewhere. So this was not satisfactory. But what we found as an interesting hypothesis was that Southern Europe had not a precise and coherent model, but was a space, was a kind of laboratory of distinct ways to justify and to implement cultural policies, sometimes oriented by the market, sometimes oriented by the classical patronship, sometimes oriented by public policies à la française. So this was this kind of laboratory which was the more satisfactory hypothesis. And in turn, there was one aspect more that defined and continue to define the cultural policy in Southern Europe is the kind of muddling through of bricolage between several kind of resources that are not always typically cultural, but that serve to implement cultural project. And the lesson of this first example is that no peripheral situation can be defined by a single criterion. In particular, the idea that the periphery is backward implies that the center models are more advanced in a way that is both condescending and perfectly reversible. Are not the periphery and its inventive tinkering the cutting edge of contemporary cultural capitalism? Isn't it the creativity of the periphery both a constraint and a resource that central actors do not have at their own disposal due to their conservative linked to vested interests? My second example would be about cultural practices. The major sociological surveys on cultural practices in France, Portugal, Spain, Belgium, United States show the diversity of peripheral situation from a social point of view. The dominant centrality in all these studies is everywhere that of the diploma. The higher the level is, the more intense and varied the cultural practices are. Bourdieu and Peterson still are right. But this variable is not enough. We must also add the geographical criterion, which influences the level of cultural practices according to the proximity or not vis-à-vis the offer. We must add also the criterion of gender, which influences the kind of practices more than the intensity of practices. So women are overrepresented in audience of dance and literature, and men are overrepresented in the audiences of jazz and vintage car magazine reading, for instance. We must also add the criterion of age to understand the specificity of young people, cultural tasters, for instance. This question of youth culture is at the heart of a paradox very well identified by a Catalan anthropologist, Carles Feixas, that presented a conference in Novi Sad in the framework of Bispectactive, saying that both youth is hegemonic, dominant, central. Everybody wants to be young, even the senators, but youth is dominated. The youngsters are dominated, leave huge difficulties to be integrated in society. So youth is, according to our exchanges with Carles Feixas, curious things. It is a weak hegemony, a kind of contradiction in the terms. One remark about this sociology of cultural practices. It has confirmed the diversification of peripheralities, but in the same time, it confirms, without willing it, the centrality of the classical model, the institutional model. And there is a problem, because when we study cultural practices or cultural tastes, we study the more or less proximity of people to an institutional offer. So we take for granted that this institutional offer is the main value. And with Felix present in this room, with Felix, we are implementing a research project about value of cultural practices, not tastes, value. And when we question the value of culture, we don't find the main dominant value supporting cultural policy, that is aesthetic. Or to say it differently, we never find aesthetic alone. We always find aesthetic together with sensuality, emotion, Juliana, conviviality. So something that is not a pure legitimation of aesthetic, but on the contrary, a kind of appropriation of aesthetic inside other values. So it is interesting that to see that the legitimacy of aesthetic from a political point of view is even paradoxal and contradictory. Third example, I don't know, I've only 5 minutes, so I will save it. Just to say, my third example was to say a very simple thing. I'm a specialist of festivals. I know that there are 7,000 festivals in France. And when in April, each year, journalists, politicians ask me what's new with festivals, that they only talk about 6% of these festivals that are big, that leave a huge artistic price and exclusivity problem, that now face huge problem of sobriety, but only count for 6% of all festivals. So my job as a social scientist is to answer them that you are talking only about 6% of festival, ignoring what is the social reality of 96% or 94% of all festival. And the festivalization in our society does not correspond to the way through which you identify the problems and so the legitimacy in the festival camp. So just to say that the periphery is also a question of political glance. Now, what has to be done? The Leninist promised question. I will introduce a sociologist, Albert Hirschman. Albert Hirschman says, work on the reaction of people facing unsatisfactory situations. And he says that first there is voice. Voice speak of public protest, strike, demonstration, and so on. Voice. Exit. Exit speaks of defection. I leave the ground. I'm distancing voluntarily. Third, there is loyalty. Loyalty. In spite of my disagreement, I obey, because this is a rule. I obey. We can add apathy. I don't do anything. I'm absolutely passive. And I think that perhaps stronger peripheries and perspective add a new way to answer this unsatisfactory situation. That would be alternative building. Alternative building. Certainly thanks to the European Center, certainly with actors that are very well known in their artistic identity, but carrying alternative projects with citizens in space that are often peripheral, rural, in underprivileged neighborhoods, with youngsters, with migrants including, and so on. The title I was given for this keynote was, again, Being the Center. This title needs to be discussed. Does the peripheral cause imply that the periphery becomes the center? This is not necessarily a good idea. According to the philosopher Claude Lefort, post-Marxist of the late 20th century, the invention of democracy is precisely the questioning of the center. Democracy is the empty throne. Democracy is the weak center, because it is always in question. The mission of periphery is therefore to be the nightmare of the center, not its substitute. It is not a matter of becoming the center, but of betraying it. To illustrate this idea, I will refer to two Nobel Prizes, winners in literature, one Portuguese, José Saramago, and one French, Annie Ernaux. José Saramago, of which we celebrate the centenary yesterday, I think, wrote Ensayos sobre a lucidez. That is a fascinating novel. Tells the story of an election in which people defect. First by not voting, then by voting massively blank. The political center becomes mad, paranoid, ridiculous. It decrees a state of siege. The people remain joyful, make fun of the power and its theatricality. People, here the periphery of the political system, do not seek to become the center. It recovers a critical function by irony. It shows that the king is naked. The periphery is, in this sense, the nightmare of the center. Passing through and to finish with Annie Ernaux. In her literary work, Annie Ernaux evokes the question of class defectors. class defectors, those who were born in a working class environment, but whose past, educational, professional, leads them to bourgeois status. This is her case. And in her literary work, she claims a flat writing without any embellishment or bourgeois style effect. It is through this writing that she reveals her popular milieu, of her periphery. She makes exist by the art a social space considered as unworthy by the system, by the literary system, or by the political system. By doing so, she rejects two ordinary ways of considering the periphery, the miserabilism and the populism. The miserabilism is the condescending recognition of the periphery. It is recognized only on the condition that it remains peripheral and that the center remains itself. On the contrary, populism is a claim to make the periphery, with a risk of demagogy, the new center. This double rejection by Annie Ernaux allows first of all to consider the periphery as a space, social and cultural, alive. It is not defined by the lack of what the center has. The periphery is not deprivation, it is humanity. This rejection allows also us to see the center as it is, not the place of legitimacy, but the place of a questionable pretension. It is therefore, I therefore, invite you to discuss the relevance of the peripheries in claiming centrality in order to make society. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. We will have some minutes that are off than suppose here now already for debate, but we have time for questions. Well, while people prepare their questions, I'll put you one for now. That is this critical function of the peripheries relating to the center. This permanent. Even if this condition of periphericity or peripherality may be seen completely intersectionally, in an intersectional way, but how can we cope this with, or is it because of this that we cope this with the idea of the legitimation of the cultural activities many times by their own periphericity? Because the cultural activities, most of them legitimate themselves by that critical role, and by assuming themselves as the margin, not even if claiming to wanting to be the center, but they lose their reputation mostly if among their peers if they become very central. Is that so, or?
Yes. It is so. It is just a general process of cultural recognition and artistic trajectories of success. It eliminates. There is an historian of art that explains that between the medieval age and the 20th century, if we estimate the whole artistic painting in Europe, and you see what is remaining is only 5% of the total. So there is a very pluralistic elimination, which is a social process that destroys 80–90%, more than 90% of a piece of art. This is not a fatality to be recognized by the center and be traditional, and be in the position of trihesion. I think it would be perhaps too schematic to consider that if you begin by defending a peripheral cause, you are condemned to this peripheral cause. And I think that we have to recall, concretely, I'm talking concretely, that this dimension of strategic interaction between periphery and center is a political way to define, to defend periphery. It is efficient. The ways through which you have to only stay in a peripheral artistic and social way to be coherent with yourself is not an artistic coherent point of view, in my view. If you want to defend some social spaces, some social groups, you have to defend them even in negotiating with the center, even in being present in the center. And then there are many ethical consequences of that. What do you do with your recognition? What do you do with your money? What do you do with all your symbolic and material resources? And that's the story of choreographer, of hip-hop choreographer that lead now a very prestigious place in contemporary dance sector in France, for instance.
More questions from Luis there?
Thank you, Emmanuel, for your speech. I think it was plenty of ideas and impressions that probably will enlighten us in the next days. My reflection, which is mixed reflection and a question, is about the idea that most people want to be recognized from a social point of view, recognized from an economic point of view, recognized also from a political and a cultural point of view. The issue is that there is not a single model of recognition. And the people in the center, the agents who are in the center, who can decide, who have the engines to decide, wants that we share the same values in order that we share a single model of recognition. The role of culture, I think, is to empower people to decide different models of recognitions. So, in which way, and that's now is the question, so this was the reflection, now the question is, which kind of public policy in the field of culture is the most efficient in order to bring this autonomy in a moment where demagogy and populism, different typologies of populisms, are in a way not giving us enough transparency. So we are in a moment that we don't see everything, and is a game of mirrors. We don't see what is in the other side. We are in the like Platon looking to the cave, no? That we don't see what is happening really. So that was the question. Thank you.
Very interesting question. I agree on the premises, and this recall me our lessons about perspective analysis, that the context of demagogy, I will say that is that way. The context of demagogy is a huge danger for culture, naturally, and a huge danger for the apparently more progressist ways to think of cultural policies. That is, cultural rights and cultural democracy. Because I know, and you know probably, all politicians that, with bad conscience, naturally, explain that the cultural rights, it is what people loves, and to give to people what people loves already. And it is the contrary of a cultural policy, to give people what people love. What does it mean? Without any preparation, without any attempt to make each one progress and elevate himself or herself and so on. So, but in the name of this danger, several cultural operators, directors of venue, for instance, retain their own power, seeing themselves as the best way to resist the demagogy. However, I think exactly the contrary. The contrary is not giving power to people. First, I think that many people don't want the power. And it is not a question of power. The question of recognition, the ambition that each one can recover a kind of recognition pass not through the power, pass through the progressive capacity. So the best policy is not a policy of power transfer, it is a policy of giving capacities, and it is quite different.
Okay, thank you. Now we really need to close this session because we passed our time a lot. So we'll thank you, Emmanuel.
Yeah.
I think we can continue the conversations and any questions that you have during our break. That will be shorter.